This episode is sponsored by AceHardware and Scott's new foundation soil improver. And I'm one of these guys who actually likes cutting their lawn, mainly because it doesn't require a lot of brain power and it looks great when it's done. And I did treat myself to a new lawnmower about 3 years ago, a zero turn, and that just makes it really easy. So every year I get about 10 or 15 yards of topsoil to try to smooth the lawn out, so I don't have any dips and valleys that my lawnmower will scalp the lawn. And this year I'm using the Scott's new foundation soil improver. This will reduce the soil compaction. It helps to boost water and nutrition retention. And what I really like about it is it's foolproof. I don't have to worry about using too much or setting the dial wrong and then burning my lawn. So it's as simple as dumping the foundation into the spreader, setting the spreader at 4 3/4 and getting to work. Well, I know a lot of people are welding now. It's become really big in the maker community. And I'm not doing that much of it. I may start welding again one day, but I used to do a lot of welding in the late 80s, early 90s. And I studied with the artist Jay Hooley. And when I was studying with Jay, we focused on artists like Richard Serra, who was more of a monumental sculptor, making really big pieces that I felt were really beyond me, just financially and physically. And then I came across the book Picasso and the Age of Iron, and I found that to be really inspiring. So I thought I'd tell you about it because maybe you'll find it inspiring for your artwork, your sculpture, your furniture. You never know. So Picasso and the Age of Iron, this book focuses on 5 artists: Pablo Picasso, Julio Gonzalez, who actually taught Picasso how to weld and used to do the welding for Picasso until Picasso started to do it on his own. David Smith, the American artist, who he had a huge sculpture garden up in Bolton Valley, New York, and interestingly enough, he died at the age of 65 because he was moving some scrap steel around and an old mail truck got in a very minimal accident, but all the steel came forward and crushed him. So that's another artist. So don't carry heavy things in your truck without having them secure. The artist Alexander Calder, who's famous for making mobiles. You probably have seen them. And then the other, I think the last sculptor who was in the book was Umberto Giacometti, who was also a furniture designer. He and his brother designed furniture, so definitely check that out. So I found that book to be really inspiring because all the sculptures were pretty much life-size, or they could be handled by one person. So all the sculptures I'm going to show you, I was able to make myself without the use of any heavy machinery. I was able to move it around and pick it up. And I should also mention that they're mostly all found object sculptures, which means it's just an object that I found and welded it to something else. I primarily did that because it's easier, and I find it interesting. It's like this piece here, you can see there's so much energy. I don't know what the life of this piece was before I welded it to this pipe here, but at some point somebody was really going to town on this with a sledgehammer. You can see how the metal is all bashed in, but it created this kind of cool shape. And this little twist here, which in my mind kind of represented hair, I guess. So this piece is a figurative piece. I made this when my wife Laura was pregnant with my son Jack, and so this piece is the more feminine piece, or this side is. This is the more masculine side, and then the piece in the middle here would represent the child. And so that was definitely inspired by probably the artist David Smith, who used to do these very lyrical steel sculptures, and some of them are named after his daughter. And that's, you know, all of these are going to be definitely inspired by somebody. And when I think of who that artist is, I'll mention it, because I think it's important to recognize that all your ideas are sort of coming from someone before you. It's always like a stepping stone. So anyway, that's it about this one. You can see that this is the blade from a plow. This is a pipe. This is this sort of organic piece, and I think this piece here is a railroad spike. So that's always kind of fun too, to identify some of the parts that are in the sculpture. This is another old piece. I should say that all of my sculptures are pretty old because I think I made my last sculpture around 1998 or 1999. Mainly because I realized that it's not easy to sell a sculpture and it's not easy to store a sculpture. And once I started having children, I really needed to focus on what made money. But anyway, I'm getting back into it now. And this sculpture here it's definitely inspired by a sculpture by Umberto Giacometti titled Spoon Woman, which was a cast piece. I think it was a bronze. You might be able to tell if you're familiar with cars that these are leaf springs. And what I didn't know when I made this piece is that you can't really weld spring steel, that's what a leaf spring is, without a specific rod. And so when I was making this, I would sort of spend hours. That's the thing with sculpture, it takes hours, because not only do you have to prepare the steel, but then you have to grind the welds and all that stuff. So anyway, I would spend hours sort of welding all the spring steel together to get this shape, and then go get a cup of coffee or something, come back into the shop, and you just hear all this ping ping because all the welds would be popping. And so then I realized that you needed a specific rod, and I was able to make some headway with it. And then I used the oxyacetylene torch to fill in some of the areas with brazing. The finish on this piece, it's painted with a rusty metal primer, and then I used an oil paint to kind of go over and give it this kind of patina. So the main shape here, like I said, are leaf springs. This is just a square tube that I had found somewhere. At the top of the sculpture is an old splitting wedge. At the bottom of the sculpture is also an old splitting wedge. And the kind of triangular shape at the bottom is something that I must have cut out with the torch. Another reason why I really liked using found objects, not only because the objects themselves are interesting, is it's also a lot easier, because to cut the shape, every time you make a cut with a torch, it always requires a lot of grinding. And that's what I was using back in the day. It's just an oxyacetylene torch. So if you've ever cut anything with a torch, you know how jagged that edge is. And if you don't like that jagged edge, you need to smooth it out. And the only way to do that is to get on that grinder. So I think before I show you the next sculpture, we should show you the scrap steel pile, because if you're going to get into making found object sculptures, you're going to have to start collecting some scrap steel and some of those found objects. This is my scrap steel pile. I've got a table over here with a screen, and there's a lot of smaller pieces on that table. And then I built a little deck here with 2x8s, treated 2x8s, and treated plywood. And that just keeps the steel off the ground and makes it a little bit easier to find pieces when I finally come out here. But yeah, I used to collect a lot of scrap steel. People would bring scrap steel to me, but I haven't really done that for years now. But it's amazing, all the interesting shapes. And it's pretty easy to come out here, grab a few pieces of steel, put them on a table, and just see what looks the most interesting. And other than making the garden sculptures, I used to make sculptures that would be wall pieces, and then you got to think about how heavy they are. But you could take kind of just some of the parts, put them next to each other, weld them together, and then I would build a frame around them, and they would be wall hung sculptures. So it's definitely an inspiring thing to have a scrap steel pile. And if you're going to create a sculpture garden, I think that's the first step. Just kind of keep your eyes out. There's always scrap steel, whether you're going to the recycling bin or you might even see it on the side of the road. Some of the more interesting pieces here, I really like these. These are called harrow discs. They're for plowing. And this is also spring steel, so if you're going to weld this, you have to use that specific rod. And yeah, just a lot of great shapes. Makes me want to start welding. Whenever I come out here, it makes me want to fire up the welder. My welder's an old Lincoln stick welder. It's not a very expensive welder, but it definitely did the job. This is a little bit smaller of a sculpture, and this is probably one of my last sculptures. I originally had made this sculpture with the idea that it would be a wall-mounted sculpture, because I had sold a few of them and they seemed to be more marketable. The thing with art is it's nice to make something, but after a while you realize that you have to sell something if you want to be able to keep making things. And most of the sculptures that I sold were smaller sculptures that would then be mounted onto a board and then framed in white. So they were almost like a drawing if you think about it. So that's how this one started out, but then it started to get heavier and heavier, and then eventually I put it on this base. This base is another found object. I don't know what the part is. It looks like a big plumbing kind of a part, like an industrial plumbing fitting. There's a couple interesting pieces in this. There's an old fire axe in here. There's another part to a plow. And this piece here, this metal plate, this 1/4-inch metal plate, you can see that there's a lot of welding practice going on here. And I remember having some friends out to the studio, and it was my friend Mike and his wife Jerry, and they have their welds here, you know. And it's one thing to weld with a MIG welder, which is relatively pretty easy, but if you've ever put the arc welder down onto a piece of metal, you know that feeling when it sticks, and it's just kind of, it can be a little scary. So you see all these sketchy welds here, and that's kind of funny because this sculpture has got to be more than 20 years old, and there's no finish on it. This is just rusted. I might finish it one day. I might do that kind of rusty metal primer and then do a kind of a dry brushing with an oil paint, and that finish seems to last outside for years. But it is steel. As long as it's not sitting in the ground, it doesn't really rot away that quickly. Another finish that you can put on steel is varnish. The sculptor Anthony Caro, a lot of his sculptures he would let rust and then he would varnish them, and that actually lasts a long time too. I do think that they probably need a little bit of upkeep every 5 or 10 years, but like I said, if you keep the steel off the ground, it will last a long time outside. The last sculpture is up on the hill over there, and I'm shooting the video here because it gets kind of noisy over by the road. Unfortunately, that's just how it is. But that area where that sculpture is used to be kind of just a bramble of thorny, like a thorny thicket. There was a swamp maple there. There was a big locust tree that came down during, I think, Hurricane Irene. And slowly but surely I've taken that piece of property and I'm turning it into sort of a sloping hill. And that's where I'm always using a lot of soil, because as I cut everything back, as you can imagine, over time you get dips and valleys, so I'm always filling them so I don't scalp the lawn. But that sculpture originally was in front of the barn here, and a few years ago I got my son Jack, or my sons Jack, Walter, and Michael to help me move that sculpture, and I casted a concrete base and put it up in the front. But that base has a rod going up through the center, and then that rod goes into the sculpture as kind of a safety precaution, because it won't fall over, but if somebody were to lean on it, it could fall over, so it's just a little insurance there. But that piece is completely rusted. There's no painted finish on it, and that piece is definitely inspired by the artist Anthony Caro, the guy who I was mentioned. Uses the varnish over rust as a finish for his sculptures, and maybe I'll do that one day. That piece is made with a piece of train track, a piece of forklift, one of those Harrow plowing discs, and that's probably the heaviest piece that I ever made. And I think right now the grass is just starting to come in, and once it comes in, I think it'll look pretty nice. It is one of those things that you're either going to like it. I do get a lot of those comments like, what the heck is that supposed to be? But you know, it is what it is. As far as being kind of a lawn nut, when you're trying to create a sculpture garden, your lawn is kind of, or your lawn or your garden, it kind of represents like the walls in a gallery or a museum. You want them to look good, and the better that looks, the better your sculptures are going to look, and it kind of makes the whole thing work. So that's definitely inspired me to try to keep the lawn as nice as I can. And like I said, I do enjoy mowing the lawn. One of the inspirations for trying to create this sculpture garden is the sculpture garden Storm King. And if you've ever traveled up the New York State Thruway, you've probably seen Storm King. It's where all those big sculptures are. I think it's around maybe exit 18, maybe. But next time you go up the New York State Thruway, keep a lookout and you'll probably see it. People ask me all the time about how big is this piece of property. It's just under 2 acres, and I have maintained the property on my own for all these years. And the tools that I use to maintain the property, before I got the 52-inch Bobcat CRZ, I was using a Toro 48-inch walk behind. So I had used that for all those years up until I got this zero turn, and that was a great machine. I think I bought it for $2,500. I used it for I think 18 years, and then I sold it for almost $500. So you know, it's a good machine. If you're gonna try to maintain something like this, you got to buy a professional machine. The weed whacker that I have is an Echo, and I've had that ever since I bought the house, and it works great. It starts first or second pull every season. I do use a fuel stabilizer stable in all of my gas powered tools, my lawnmower, chainsaw, weed whacker, leaf blower. And so my leaf blower is a still, and it's the second one I've owned. The first one was blown up by a friend who borrowed it and didn't put in the gas oil mixture. He just put in straight gas, and he was really good about it because he didn't even call me to tell me that it didn't work. He just showed up with a brand new leaf blower and told me that he blew up the blower. My chainsaw is a still. It's got a 16 and an 18-inch bar, and that's been enough to maintain this property. I also have an electric chainsaw. I can't get over how far electric, or not so much electric, but cordless tools have come. And my new leaf blower, this isn't what I maintain the property with. I need a real powerful machine for that. But for all the work that I do around the shop here, blowing off my little outdoor work area, and even blowing off the walls in the shop, I turn the fan on, and I use this Ego, and this thing is great. And I also just got a new weed whacker that's an Ego, which I had my doubts about, but my gas-powered one ran out of string, so I was using the cordless Ego last night, and man, it does a good job. So definitely impressed with how far cordless tools have come. So I hope you enjoyed this kind of look around the yard. And like I said, anybody can have a sculpture garden. You don't need a big piece of property. I do think that there's something really nice about combining gardening with sculpture, whether that's whether that's stone sculpture or steel sculpture or whatever you're interested in. But it's kind of a nice thing to do, and I think it complements the landscape. So a big thank you to AceHardware and Scott's, and as always, thanks for tuning in, and I'll see you next time.
Nice. Doesn't really look that great here.
All right, that's good.
Yeah, Matthew.